There's a moment, and I think everyone who's ever served on a deep space station knows exactly what I'm talking about, where you stop feeling like a guest and start feeling like furniture. Not in a bad way, not exactly. It's more like the station breathes around you, the corridors learn your footsteps. The ambient hum of the recycled air starts to feel less like machinery and more like the sound of someone breathing next to you in the dark. You get used to it. And then, somewhere in that getting used to it, you forget that you're not home. That's what happened to me. That's why I wasn't more careful. My name is Marcus Elroy Dane. I'm 34 years old, from a small town in eastern Tennessee that nobody's ever heard of. And I somehow ended up as a Grade 3 human liaison aboard the Galactic Cooperative's orbital processing hub designated Theta Vos, which orbits the outer rim of what the Vos-Kalhari species call the Singing Belt, a band of asteroid formations so dense with crystalline mineral deposits that they literally hum in certain radio frequencies. It's beautiful, actually. If you press your ear to the outer hull at just the right spot near Cargo Bay 12, you can feel it vibrating. But that's not the story. The story starts about 8 months into my assignment, on a Tuesday. I kept Earth calendar days out of stubbornness, which several of my alien colleagues found deeply eccentric, when I made a decision that seemed completely reasonable at the time. I decided to change clothes in what I thought was an empty auxiliary maintenance corridor. I want to be clear, this was not a dramatic decision. I was not stripping down dramatically. I had spilled coolant fluid on my uniform top during a particularly chaotic moment in the environmental systems bay. The secondary changing facility was locked for sterilization. My quarters were on the complete other side of the station, and I had a cultural liaison meeting in 11 minutes. I grabbed a spare tunic from my kit bag. I ducked into Corridor 14C, which had been empty every single time I'd walked through it for 3 weeks. I pulled off my soiled shirt. And that is when I heard them. Not loud, not immediately alarming, just two voices. Soft, layered, almost melodic in that way Vos-Kalhari speech tends to be when it's not being filtered through a translation matrix. Like someone playing two flutes at once, slightly out of sync. I froze. They didn't. Because by the time I registered that someone was there, they had already turned the corner. And the two Vos-Kalhari sisters, Sarava and Corvin, though I didn't know their names yet, had already seen me. Standing there, shirt off, coolant fluid still drying on my left forearm. And their reaction. God, their reaction. That's the part I still think about, months later, lying awake in my bunk while the singing belt hums through the hull. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the embarrassment, which was considerable, not the awkwardness, which was almost physically painful. Their reaction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because if I don't lay the groundwork, you won't understand why it mattered so much. You won't understand what was actually happening in that corridor, or what it meant, not just for me, but for everything that came after. The station. Theta Vos is not a glamorous posting. I want to be completely honest about that, because I've read some of the recruiting materials the cooperative puts out, and they make these orbital processing hubs sound like gleaming beacons of interspecies cooperation. All polished floors and synchronized lighting and beings from 17 worlds gathered harmoniously to advance the shared cause of galactic civilization. And okay, yes, there are polished floors in some sections. The diplomatic atrium has polished floors. But I worked in cargo processing, environmental systems support, and cultural liaison. My office, and I use that term loosely, was a converted equipment closet on Deck 7 that had been repurposed as a human cultural integration suite, which is a very impressive name for a room with a desk, 2 chairs, a translation terminal, and a wall-mounted display that showed a live feed of Earth's northern hemisphere because some bureaucrat in the Exchange Commission thought it would help us feel connected to home. It mostly just made me miss Tennessee. The station itself is shaped like a flattened ring, maybe 300 meters in diameter if you walked the full outer corridor. 37 decks if you counted the subfloors, which most people didn't. About 400 permanent crew members from 11 different species, plus a rotating population of transit workers, traders, researchers, and the occasional diplomatic delegation that would appear for 2 weeks, disrupt everything, and then vanish back toward whatever system they came from. Humans were not common on Theta Vos. There were 11 of us when I arrived, and we were spread across 4 different departments, which meant we didn't cluster together the way humans sometimes do when they're nervous in alien environments. We were distributed, embedded. I think that was intentional on the part of the Exchange Commission. They'd figured out that when you put too many humans together in a non-Earth environment, we start recreating Earth, which apparently makes integration harder. So they spread us thin, put us in different departments, and trusted that we'd adapt. Most of us did. I adapted pretty well, I think. I learned enough Voskalhari to navigate basic conversations without the translation matrix. I figured out the social cues around the Methdura workers in cargo. Their species uses posture as a primary communication channel, and once I understood that standing with my weight on my left foot was unintentionally signaling that I was looking for a fight, things got a lot smoother in cargo bay processing. I learned which sections of the station were maintained at temperatures that wouldn't give me hypothermia and which ones were fine. I learned to sleep through the ambient sonic emissions of the crystalline engines. 8 months in, I wasn't just surviving Theta Vos. I was actually doing the job. The cultural liaison role, specifically, was something I'd grown into. It's essentially a buffer position. You're the person who catches misunderstandings before they become incidents. You translate not just language, but context, intention, behavioral meaning. When a Voskalhari administrator looks at a human the wrong way, and that human interprets it as hostility when it was actually an expression of deep professional respect, you're there to explain it. When a human does something that an alien crew member finds baffling or offensive or concerning, you're there to explain that too. Both directions. Always both directions. Which is why, when I tell you what happened in Corridor 14C, I need you to understand the context. I need you to understand what the Voskalhari actually are, and what they knew and didn't know about human bodies. The VUSSKLHARI. The species classification documents describe them as bipedal sapients from a temperate gas giant moon, roughly humanoid in proportion, but distinct in nearly every surface detail. The classification documents are technically accurate and almost completely unhelpful for actually interacting with them. Here's what you actually need to know. The Voskalhari are tall. Most of them stand between 6.5 and 7 feet, with a build that's leaner than human average, limbs slightly longer in proportion to torso. Their skin is bioluminescent in a passive, low-level way, not glowing dramatically like something out of a science fiction film. But there's a subtle luminescence in the undertones, particularly visible in low light. That gives their skin a quality that humans often describe as looking like moonlight trapped just beneath the surface. Their faces are broadly humanoid, 2 eyes, a nose structure, a mouth, but the proportions are slightly shifted. Their eyes are large, with a wider visible iris and a reflective quality that means in low light they seem to glow faintly amber or gold or silver depending on the individual. Their hair, if you can call it that, grows in structures that are closer to fine, semi-rigid filaments than mammalian hair, and it tends to respond slowly to emotional states, the way some Earth species' fur responds to threat. They have 4 fingers on each hand. They're roughly warm-blooded, or at least warm enough that the station's regulated temperature is comfortable for both species. They breathe a similar enough atmospheric mixture that we don't need separate environmental zones, which is part of why Theta Vos is able to run as an integrated crew rather than a zoned one. They live on average about 200 years. They have a concept of family that is deeply, structurally different from human family models, but the one thread of similarity that every cultural briefing document emphasizes is this. The sibling bond among Voskalhari is considered the most stable, most enduring, and most sacred relationship in their entire social framework. Not parent-child, which they consider transitional by nature. Not romantic partnership, which they consider elective and therefore less binding. Sibling. Sisters, brothers, the bond formed in the early development phase, shared across the specific environmental and physiological experiences of growing up in the same household unit. In Voskalhari culture, a sibling is the one relationship that nothing can sever. They have a word for it, Varathkeln, that doesn't translate cleanly into English, but the closest approximation is something like, the one who saw you before you knew yourself. Sareva and Corvin were sisters. I did not know that when I first saw them. I learned it later after everything. But looking back, it explains something, the way they moved in that corridor. The way they turned the corner together, their movements unconsciously synchronized, like two instruments that had been playing the same piece of music for so long they'd stopped needing sheet music. 8 MONTHS in. By the time of the corridor incident, I'd been on the station long enough to have a routine. Morning by Earth clock, which I maintained stubbornly, started with the hydration station on Deck 7, which dispensed something approximately equivalent to coffee that I'd finally convinced the systems team to calibrate correctly after 6 weeks of gentle lobbying. Then a walk through the Cultural Affairs corridor to check my message queue. Then a brief check-in with Dr. Feneva Alst, the Voskelhari administrator who technically oversaw my department, in a meeting that lasted exactly 8 minutes every morning because she was the most precise and efficient being I had ever encountered, and she ran meetings like a Swiss watch crossed with a military operation. Then the actual work, which varied. Processing cultural incident reports, which ranged from genuinely serious misunderstandings to situations so minor they barely warranted documentation. Preparing orientation materials for new crew members, occasionally sitting in on formal cultural exchange sessions, which were scheduled events where crew members from different species were supposed to share information about their cultures in a structured format. Those sessions were, in my experience, alternately fascinating and agonizing, depending entirely on who was facilitating and how willing everyone was to be honest versus diplomatic. I facilitated 6 of them in my first 8 months. I was honest. Several of them got a little heated. But they produced real results, and Dr. Feneva Alst told me in one of our 8-minute morning meetings that my facilitation outcomes were notably above the expected threshold for a grade 3 liaison of this tenure, which from her was essentially a standing ovation. I was proud of that. I'm telling you this so you understand. I was not a mess. I was not stumbling around the station confused and out of my depth. I had built something that worked, which made the coolant incident both more embarrassing and, ultimately, more impactful. Because if I'd still been a confused newcomer, the sisters' reaction might have been politely filed under humans are unpredictable and forgotten. But I wasn't a newcomer. I was someone they'd actually heard about, in the way that crew members on small stations always hear about each other through the slow osmosis of shared workspace and communal meals. They knew who I was before I knew who they were. That matters. The coolant incident. It started in Environmental Systems Bay 4, at approximately 1400 hours, Earth-calibrated Tuesday. I was there as part of a routine liaison observation. Whenever there was significant maintenance work involving crews from multiple species, I was supposed to be present to smooth over any communication friction. Usually it was uneventful. This time, a Durrani maintenance engineer named Geth Vosprail, and I always got mildly confused by how many Voskelhari names used Vos as a component, given that the station was literally named Theta Vos. But I'd been told it was a geographic origin marker, like people in my grandfather's time having surnames like York or Essex. Anyway, Geth was draining a secondary coolant line, and the junction coupling was older than it looked. It failed. Not catastrophically. There was no danger. Just a sharp release of pressurized coolant fluid, pale blue, slightly viscous, temperature approximately 4 degrees Celsius, directly at my upper body. I said several things that I will not be documenting here, because this is an official ICEC report, and I maintain at least some professional standards. The Durrani maintenance crew thought it was hilarious, which I know because I'd learned to read their facial structures well enough to recognize amusement when I saw it. Geth made a sound that was his species' equivalent of a snort laugh and apologized in 3 languages, 2 of which I didn't speak. My uniform top was soaked. The coolant wasn't harmful to human skin. I'd checked months ago because I'm professionally cautious that way. But it was cold and sticky and smelled like something between machine oil and sea salt, and I absolutely could not show up to the Cultural Affairs meeting in an hour smelling like that. The primary changing facility on Deck 7 was 14 minutes away from Environmental Systems Bay 4. The secondary changing facility on Deck 6 was 3 minutes away, but the meeting 3 days earlier had flagged it for sterilization after a Felcantha researcher had an unfortunate incident involving a biological sample container and their personal belongings. The sterilization would be complete in approximately 40 minutes, which was 30 minutes after my meeting started. I had my kit bag with me. I always keep a spare tunic in my kit bag because I've been working on Theta Vos long enough to know that things go wrong, and it's better to be prepared. There are 6 auxiliary maintenance corridors on Deck 6 that connect the service infrastructure. They're used by the automated maintenance systems primarily, small robotic repair units that travel the corridors on scheduled routes. Human-sized traffic through them is infrequent. Corridor 14C was the closest to both my current location and the meeting room I needed to reach. It was a dead-end branch off the main corridor, about 20 meters deep, used primarily to access a cluster of environmental monitoring nodes. Not a thoroughfare, not anywhere near the main crew paths. I had walked through it or passed it dozens of times in 8 months, and I had never, not once, seen another crew member inside it. So I made a decision that seemed completely logical at the time. I went to Corridor 14C, set down my kit bag at the far end near the environmental monitoring cluster, pulled out my clean tunic, and began to take off my soiled shirt. The corridor. I want to describe Corridor 14C accurately, because the physical details matter for understanding what happened next. It's narrow, about 2 meters wide, with smooth composite walls in the station's standard gray-blue, running about 20 meters from the junction point to the dead end at the monitoring cluster. The lighting is standard low-white, slightly dimmer than the main corridors because it's a service space. There are no windows. We're on an inner deck. The only sounds are the baseline mechanical hum of the station systems, and if the conditions are right and you press your hand to the wall near the monitoring cluster, the faint crystalline resonance from the singing belt filtering through the hull. The entrance is at the junction, which means that from the far end, where I was standing with my back partially turned, wrestling with a uniform top that had gotten stiff from the coolant drying at the collar. You can hear footsteps in the main corridor, but you can't see around the junction until someone has already turned into 14C. I heard them, I think. Faint, slightly melodic footfalls. Vos Kelhari tend to walk quietly, their body weight distributed differently than humans. But I processed the sound as background noise, as the station breathing around me, because that's what 8 months of habituation does to you. I had the soiled top halfway over my head when I heard the voices. By then, it was too late. I yanked the top off completely, partly because stopping halfway seemed worse, partly because my brain was making the panic calculation that completing the action would let me get the clean tunic on faster. I had about 3 seconds of standing there bare-chested, coolant still drying on my left forearm, clean tunic bunched in my right hand, before I managed to turn around enough to confirm what my ears were already telling me. 2 Vos Kelhari women had turned into Corridor 14C, and they had completely stopped moving. The first reaction. I've tried to describe their expression many times in the months since it happened. I've tried to describe it to Dr. Fenevalst, who listened carefully and then gently suggested that what I was struggling to articulate was the cross-species problem of reading facial expressions that evolved in an entirely different social and biological context. She's right, that's part of it. But it's not all of it. Because even accounting for the cross-species difficulty, even accounting for the fact that Vos Kelhari faces do not map directly onto human emotional expression, even with all of that, what I saw on their faces was recognizable. It just wasn't the reaction I expected. I expected discomfort. I expected the alien equivalent of walking in on someone in an awkward moment, a kind of social flinch, a rapid redirect of gaze, a retreat. The taller of the two, I later learned this was Sarava, the elder sister, took 1 step backward. Just one. Then she stopped. And she stared. Not with discomfort, not with embarrassment, not with the social panic I was radiating from every pore of my body. She stared with an expression that I can only describe as, and this is going to sound strange, wonder. Genuine, almost unguarded wonder. Her large amber eyes were wide, wider than I'd seen Vos Kelhari eyes go, and the subtle luminescence in her skin seemed to shift, brightening slightly in the undertones around her cheekbones. The second one, Corvin, the younger sister, reacted differently. She reached out and grabbed Sarava's arm, not in a let's leave gesture, in a do you see what I see gesture. And then she said something. I didn't catch it. They weren't using the common trade tongue. They were speaking their own language, layered and soft, and I only had conversational Vaskelhari at that point. But the tone was not alarmed, not disgusted, not amused at my expense. It sounded like someone trying to name something they'd never seen before. I managed to get the clean tunic over my head in approximately the most graceless fashion imaginable. My face was, I am confident, the color of arterial blood. And then we all just stood there, for a moment that lasted approximately forever. I was the first to speak, because I am a cultural liaison, and it is literally my job to navigate awkward cross-species situations, and also because the silence was going to kill me. "I'm sorry," I said in trade tongue. "The secondary facility was there was a coolant incident, and I thought this corridor was I'm very sorry. I should have." Sareva held up one hand. That gesture, the raised open palm, I knew it. Vaskelhari used it to indicate I understand, or you may stop explaining. It's a calming gesture, not a silencing one. She used it gently. "Human," she said. Her trade tongue was careful, accented, precise. "You are Marcus Dane, the cultural liaison." "Yes," I said. My voice was doing something unfortunate. "That's me, again very sorry." She tilted her head. The filaments of her hair shifted slowly with the motion, catching the corridor's low light. "You were changing your outer garment," she said. It wasn't a question. It was stated with the careful precision of someone cataloging information. "Yes," I said. "Because of a maintenance incident. Coolant line failure, I'm sorry." She tilted her head the other way. "You do not need to apologize," she said. "We entered this corridor without announcement. The responsibility for the interruption belongs to us." I opened my mouth to tell her no, it was fine. I shouldn't have been changing here anyway. Standard social ritual deflection. Then Corvin spoke. Her trade tongue was slightly less precise than her sister's, but faster, more eager. She said, "The marks on your skin, the patterns. Were those present before the coolant incident, or did the coolant?" "Corvin," Sareva said, one word, a warning. Corvin stopped, but she didn't look away. I looked down at my arms, confused. My new tunic had short sleeves, standard liaison uniform, so my forearms were still visible. I had the coolant drying on my left arm, yes. But on my right arm, wrapping up over my elbow, was the tattoo I'd had since I was 22. A stylized topographic map of the section of Tennessee mountains where I grew up, done in black linework by an artist in Knoxville who'd spent 6 hours and charged me far too much money and produced something I'd never once regretted. I had completely forgotten about it. Because on Earth, a tattoo is so mundane it doesn't register. On Theta Vos, in 8 months of daily interactions, not one person had ever commented on it. Most species on the station didn't use skin markings as a cultural practice, but they were also used to the variety of human presentations by now. We weren't a novelty. Except to these two, who were, as I was only beginning to realize, relatively new to the station. After the corridor, the cultural affairs meeting was, fortunately for everyone involved, a low-stakes agenda day, routine rotation updates, and a brief on upcoming diplomatic transit schedules. I attended with a clean tunic, slightly damp hair from the quick rinse I'd managed, and the particular internal composure of a person who has decided to simply not think about the last 15 minutes until later. I thought about it during the entire meeting. I did not sleep particularly well that night. Here's the thing about those kinds of incidents in an interspecies environment. The cultural weight of them is almost always impossible to assess in the moment. On Earth, walking in on someone changing would be embarrassing for everyone, there would be apologies, and it would be forgotten within a week. But on a station like Theta Vos, every interaction between species carries the possibility of being more than an incident. It carries the possibility of being a data point, a reference. The thing that shapes how one species understands another. I was the cultural liaison. I knew this better than almost anyone, which meant that lying awake at approximately 2 in the morning, station time, I was running 2 parallel anxieties. One was the ordinary human embarrassment. That was straightforward. I had been caught half-dressed in a service corridor. This is embarrassing. The embarrassment would fade. The other was professional. I was trying to reconstruct what they had actually seen, not the emotional experience of it, but the cultural information. Vaskalhari, I knew from the standard briefings, have a different relationship with body privacy than humans do. Their species doesn't share our particular anxiety about physical exposure. Their equivalent emotional vulnerabilities are located in different places. Showing skin wasn't for them what it was for a human. That I understood. What I didn't understand was what Corvin had been reacting to. The tattoo, the marks on the skin. And more than that, the expression on Sarava's face. That wide-eyed, luminous undertoned expression that I couldn't stop seeing when I closed my eyes. The expression that looked like wonder. What exactly had she seen? Dr. Piacenivigalesti. I brought it to Dr. Fenivalst the next morning. The morning meeting ran 32 minutes. This was deeply unusual and I think constituted some kind of record. I told her what had happened, clearly, without excessive self-consciousness, because I'd decided overnight that treating it as a professional situation rather than a personal embarrassment was the only way to actually figure out what was going on. She listened without interruption, which was also unusual. Her standard mode was to interject with precise clarifications every few minutes. This time she let me finish entirely. Then she was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted. You said the younger sister reacted to markings on your skin, she said. My tattoo, yes, she seemed, I searched for the word, startled but curious, not disturbed. And the elder sister showed a luminescent brightening in the facial undertones. Yes, around the cheekbones. Another pause. Marcus, she said. She used my first name approximately 3 times per year, usually when something genuinely important was happening. Are you familiar with the Vaskalhari physiological history? Broadly. I read the standard cultural briefing. The standard briefing, she said, with a precision that somehow communicated volumes of gentle criticism without actually saying anything critical, does not cover what I am about to tell you. She settled back in her chair, a motion that, for Vaskalhari, indicates that the speaker is preparing to say something they consider foundational rather than supplementary. The Vaskalhari, she said, in their pre-spaceflight history, developed in a relatively uniform physical environment. Their moon has lower UV radiation than most habitable bodies. The biological result is that their species did not develop significant variations in skin tone or in what you might call skin texture. Every member of their species in the pre-contact era looked broadly similar in these surface characteristics. I was following her, but not yet seeing where she was going. The bioluminescent undertones that you observe, she continued, are present in all Vaskalhari, but are subtle enough that they did not serve as a strong individual differentiator. The filament structures of their hair show more individual variation, and their species placed significant social meaning on hair patterning as a marker of individual identity. Okay, I said. They did not have a concept, she said carefully, of deliberately altering the appearance of the skin, permanently by choice. I stopped. I looked at my arm. Tattoos, I said slowly. They have encountered humans before, she said. But not extensively. The Exchange Commission's records indicate that the previous human liaison on Theta Vos, this was before your tenure, did not have visible skin markings, and the 2 officers you encountered are recent transfers. Their prior postings were at stations with no permanent human crew. I sat with that for a moment. They've never seen a tattoo before, I said. In person, she clarified. They may have read descriptions, seen images, but the images in standard cross-species orientation materials tend toward the diagrammatic, clinical, not the same as encountering one directly. On a person, I added. On a person in a physical context, that made the markings very visible, yes. The corridor, the bare arm, the black linework running from wrist to elbow. I thought about Corvin's voice, the patterns, the marks on your skin, and suddenly the wonder in it made a different kind of sense. What would it mean to them, I asked, culturally, someone choosing to permanently mark their own skin? Dr. Fenivalst considered this with the care she brought to everything. The Vaskalhari value permanence, she said. The Varathkeln bond, the sibling relationship, is sacred partly because it cannot be undone. Their architecture, their relationships, their oaths, they have a deep cultural preference for things that do not change. She paused. A human who chooses to permanently inscribe something on their own body, she said, would be perceived through that cultural lens, not as something strange, not as something primitive or concerning, as something that speaks the language of permanent commitment. That's not how most humans think about tattoos, I said. I know, she said, but it is perhaps how they would receive it. The expression on the elder sister's face, I started. Sareva, she said. Her name is Sareva. She is the chief science officer of the new environmental monitoring installation currently being set up on decks 4 through 6. Corvin is her research specialist. They arrived 11 days ago. Sareva, I repeated. The expression she had, I kept thinking it looked like wonder. Dr. Fenevalst met my eyes. Hers were a deeper amber than most Voskelhari I'd encountered, older, I'd come to realize, and somehow more textured. It probably was, she said simply. Part 2, the things that were said and unsaid. I want to tell you something about cultural liaison work that they don't put in the brochures. The moments that matter most are almost never the scheduled ones. They're not the formal exchange sessions, where everyone is prepared and performing and aware that they're supposed to be learning about each other. They're not the diplomatic briefings or the orientation packets or the carefully curated cultural experiences that the Exchange Commission designs to facilitate understanding. They're the corridor moments, the coolant spill moments, the moments when you're half-dressed and someone turns a corner and something unscripted happens and both parties have to figure out, in real time, what they're actually made of. I keep a log, not the official incident log that I file with the ICEC. This one is personal, handwritten, in a physical notebook I brought from Earth specifically because I didn't trust digital records with the things I actually thought. The log says, on the day after the corridor incident, in somewhat uneven handwriting that suggests I wrote it at 2 in the morning. Something happened today. I don't fully understand what yet, but I think it might matter. I didn't go looking for Sareva and Corvin after the corridor incident. This was a deliberate choice. As a cultural liaison, my instinct was to address things directly and professionally, acknowledge the awkward situation, establish a normal working interaction, move on. But Dr. Fenevalst's information had shifted my frame enough that I wanted to think before acting. The worst thing I could do, I reasoned, was to approach them in a way that either embarrassed them or made the interaction even more laden with significance than it already felt. Theta Vos is a small station. I trusted that we would encounter each other again. We did sooner than I expected. The communal meal facility on Deck 8 runs 3 service periods per station day, and I used the middle one, approximately 1,800 hours, because it was usually less crowded than the primary evening service, and I'd found a table near the viewport that nobody else seemed to value as much as I did. From it, on a clear processing day, you could see the singing belt catching the distant star's light, the crystalline formations fracturing it into something that looked less like space and more like stained glass. I was eating something the food system had synthesized that was meant to be pasta. It got the texture mostly right, if not the flavor, and looking at the belt when I heard chairs being moved at the table beside mine. I looked up. Sareva met my eyes immediately. She had the quality of someone who does not flinch from direct eye contact, which in Voskelhari is a mark of confidence rather than aggression. Corvin beside her looked at my arms first and then my face in that order. Then she looked quickly at her food tray. Something happened in her expression that I read with reasonable confidence as the Voskelhari equivalent of awkward. Marcus Dane, Sareva said, my full name, the same way she'd used it in the corridor. May we? She gestured to the chairs at my table. Of course, I said, please. The table was a 4-seater, so there was room. They settled in with the unconscious coordination I'd noticed before, that synchronized quality, as if they'd been moving in relation to each other for so long that proximity had its own choreography. For a moment, we all paid attention to our food. Then Corvin said, quickly, like she'd been composing the sentence and needed to get it out before she second-guessed herself. I want to apologize for yesterday, what I said about your skin. It was not appropriate curiosity for a first meeting. I looked at her. Her eyes were lighter than her sister's, a pale gold rather than amber. Young, genuinely distressed by whatever she'd decided she'd done wrong. Don't apologize, I said. I'm a cultural liaison. Questions about physical differences between species are exactly the kind of thing I'm here to help with. You didn't do anything wrong. I was startled, she said, and startlement made me forward. I was standing half-dressed in a maintenance corridor. You had more reason to be startled than I did. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Voskelhari smiles are structurally different from human ones, a slight widening and lifting at the outer edge of the mouth rather than the central upward curve. But the intention was similar. You were not expecting us, she said. I genuinely believed that corridor was empty. It is usually, Sarava said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down. Her voice was quieter than her sister's, lower in register. We have taken to using it as a transit route from the new monitoring installation to the service junction. The main corridors are busy, for individuals still orienting to a new station. Something in the way she said it made me hear the other thing underneath it. The crowded corridors of a new posting, when you're still figuring out where everything is, who everyone is, what the rhythms of the place mean. When you still feel like a guest, not furniture. 11 days, I said. It takes longer than 11 days. She looked at me with that direct amber gaze. How long did it take you? I thought about it honestly. About 4 months before I stopped feeling like I was performing competence instead of actually having it. About 6 before the station started to feel like the sound of somewhere, rather than the sound of something. Her head tilted. The sound of somewhere rather than the sound of something, that distinction. Home has a sound, I said. When a place is new, it just makes noise. After a while, it starts to sound like somewhere that knows you're there. Corvin had stopped pretending to eat. She was watching me with the focused attention of someone who wants to hold a thought carefully. That is a very particular way of describing it, she said. In our language, there is a word, vethsorna, for the moment when a new place ceases to feel like performance and begins to feel like witness. You are describing the same concept. Maybe all conscious species hit the same walls, I said. Perhaps, Sarava said, or perhaps the walls are just similar enough to recognize from both sides. The question that wasn't rude. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes that first dinner. I know because I checked the timestamp when I finally got back to my quarters and sat down on my bunk and spent a few minutes just being still. Most of it was straightforward. They asked about my work. I explained the liaison role in terms that translated well enough. I asked about the environmental monitoring installation, and Sarava described it with the precision of someone who thinks in systems. The new array would expand the station's capacity to track crystalline resonance patterns in the belt, both for navigation data and for what she called, in careful trade tongue, the possibility of signal structure. She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. Corvin was a xenobiologist by specialty, working as Sarava's research specialist, but with her own parallel research threads. She was, I gathered, deeply interested in the biological variants across the known species of the cooperative, not in an abstract way, but in the specific, tactile way of someone who wanted to understand how different bodies worked from the inside out. She was also, I was fairly certain, burning to ask about the tattoo. I could see it. Every few minutes she would glance at my forearm and then redirect her gaze with the careful control of someone observing conversational manners that were slightly at war with genuine curiosity. About 40 minutes in, I helped her. You can ask, I said. About the marks on my skin, it's not a sensitive topic. She looked at her sister quickly. Some silent communication passed between them. Then she looked at me. The marks are permanent, she said. Yes. You chose to place them there. I did. And they represent something specific, or are they decorative? There was no hierarchy in the question. She wasn't implying that decorative was lesser, just categorizing. Both, I said. This one, I turned my right arm so the topographic tattoo was clearly visible in the meal facility's light. This is a map of mountains in the region of Earth where I was born and where I grew up. The lines represent changes in elevation, the height and shape of the land. She leaned forward slightly. Sarava, I noticed, also looked. You carry the shape of your origin on your skin, Corvin said, slowly, like she was translating something. That's one way to put it. So that it is permanent. So that it stays. A pause, then Corvin said something to Sarava in their language, soft, a single sentence. Sarava responded in 2 words. What did you say? I asked, then, if you're willing to tell me. Corvin considered. I said he has made his home part of his body so that the body cannot be separated from the home. Sarava said, yes. I sat with that for a moment. That's a better explanation than I've ever given, I said. Is it accurate? More accurate than the explanation I usually use, which is that I was 22 and thought it seemed like a good idea at the time. The corner of Corvin's mouth lifted, a Vaskelhari near smile. Both things can be true. Both things are true, I confirmed. What, Servh asked. It was near the end of the meal, when we were all done eating and the table between us had that relaxed quality of a conversation that had already done its work and was now coasting. Corvin had gone to return her tray, and it was just Sarava and me for a moment. She looked at my arm, then at my face. When I first saw you, she said, in the corridor, there is a word in our language, Vamathilrai, it does not translate directly. The closest approximation is the surprise of recognizing something you were not aware you were looking for. Vamathilrai, I repeated. The sounds were complicated but not impossible for a human mouth. Your pronunciation is acceptable, she said, with an expression that I'd already learned meant that was better than I expected. I felt that in the corridor, not from the interruption itself, from seeing the markings. Because our species does not do this. We have ceremony. We have the markings of family relationship that are recorded in genealogical documentation, in home architecture, in the physical objects we carry, but not on the body itself. And when I saw it, she paused. I thought, this being carries something that cannot be left behind, that cannot be taken, that goes everywhere the body goes. That's it exactly, I said quietly. For us, she said, the permanent things are external. A sibling bond is permanent, but we record it in words, in ritual, in the agreements of family. If we were separated, something subtle moved in her expression. The bond would remain, but the record might not. I thought about what Dr. Fenevalst had told me about the sibling bond, about Vereth Keln. But for you, she continued, the record is on the body. It goes with you. Yes. She searched for the word, into whatever happens next. Yes. She nodded, a slow, considered motion. Then she said something that I've returned to more times than I can count. I think I understand now why you were not more embarrassed than you were, she said. In the corridor, you were exposed, but you were not. She paused again, finding it. Not diminished, she said finally. No, I said, I hadn't thought about it in those terms until that moment. No, I wasn't. Because whatever you carry on your skin cannot be diminished by being seen. I looked at her. The ambient light of the meal facility was doing what low station light always did to Vaskalhari's skin, making the luminescent undertones more visible, so that in the right angle she looked like she was lit from somewhere internal rather than external. You said Vamathilrai, I said, the surprise of recognizing something you were looking for without knowing it. Yes. Is that still what it feels like, now that you know what the marks are? She considered this, with the thoroughness she seemed to bring to everything. No, she said, now it feels like a brief pause. I do not have the trade tongue word, the closest is meeting. Meeting? Not the first moment, the moment after, when the surprise has settled and what remains is recognition. Two things that have found themselves next to each other, and confirmed that the finding was not accidental. Corvin came back to the table just then, and whatever might have been said next folded back into the ordinary motion of a conversation winding down. But I wrote meeting in my personal log that night. I drew a small box around it. Part 3, the investigation and the education. Corvin asked to look at the tattoo properly. She asked 3 days after the dinner, via an official Exchange Commission communication channel, which is how I knew she'd thought about whether to ask and decided that the formal channel was safest. Polite. Correct. I replied via the same channel that I was happy to facilitate a cross-species cultural exchange conversation about human body modification practices, and that she was welcome to ask anything she needed to. We met in my office, the converted equipment closet, which I had at least made somewhat hospitable with a plant I was keeping alive out of stubbornness, and a photograph of the Tennessee mountains that matched, roughly, the topographic lines on my arm. She came alone, without Sareva. That was notable. Given everything Dr. Fenevalst had told me about the sibling bond, the fact that she came alone meant something. It meant she was separating the personal curiosity from whatever the experience had meant to her sister. Or possibly, and I was becoming more attentive to these possible interpretations, she was giving the experience space to be her own. She sat in the visitor's chair and looked at the photograph on my wall immediately. "The mountains," she said. "The mountains. And the tattoo is a topographic map of the same view, roughly. The artist took some liberties with the eastern ridge, but the essential geography is correct." She leaned forward. I rested my right arm on the desk between us, forearm up, and she studied it with the particular focus of a scientist, thorough, methodical, moving from the wrist up along the linework. "How was it made?" she asked. I explained the tattooing process. The needle, the pigment, the layers of skin, the permanence that came from the depth of pigment placement. The healing. The fact that the outermost cells would shed and replace over time, but the design remained because the pigment was seated deep enough to be beyond the reach of the body's replacement cycle. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "It would have hurt." "Yes. For an extended period." "Several hours, yes." "And you continued through the pain." "I did." She processed this, because the result was something I wanted enough that the cost was acceptable, I said. "And also because by the time you're 2 hours in, stopping feels like a worse option than finishing." She almost smiled. "The commitment logic. You know that logic." "Every researcher knows that logic," she said. "You are deep enough into the methodology that abandoning it costs more than completing it." A pause. "But this was not research." "No, it was more," I tried to find the accurate word. "It was a decision to make something permanent. I was 22. I had just left home for the first time, genuinely left, for a long stretch. And I think some part of me knew that leaving changes you, and I wanted to carry something with me that wouldn't change." She looked at the mountains in the photograph, then at the lines on my arm. "The mountains did not change," she said. "Mountains change very slowly, slowly enough that on a human time scale they're permanent." "A useful scale," she said quietly. Then she looked up at me with those pale gold eyes. "Humans have many of these practices, marking the body. Many, across many cultures and many thousands of years of human history. The specific practices vary enormously, but the impulse," I thought about how to say it, "the impulse to carry meaning on the body seems to be something humans return to across time and geography." "What kinds of meaning?" And so we spent 2 hours going through it. I'm not going to reproduce the entire conversation here, partly because it was 2 hours and partly because it was, genuinely, one of the best conversations I had in my entire posting, and some of it belongs in my personal log rather than an ICEC document. But I'll tell you the outline. I talked about tattooing as memorial, carrying the names or images of those who had died so that the dead were not left behind. Corvin was quiet for a long time after this. In Vaskalhari culture, death practices center on permanent architectural inscription. The names of the dead are carved into specific structures, maintained for generations. Portable mourning was a different concept. I talked about tattooing as declaration, carrying a belief, a value, a political or spiritual commitment on the body as a statement of identity. She found this particularly interesting from an academic perspective, asking about the role of visibility, whether declarations meant to be seen by others functioned differently than declarations that were private or concealed by clothing. I talked about tattooing as story, carrying a narrative of one's own life on the skin, each marking a chapter marker in a life lived. I talked about cultural traditions across human history and geography, the practices that preceded modern tattooing by thousands of years, the spiritual significance in various traditions, the complex history of how the practice had been adopted, suppressed, stigmatized, reclaimed, and transformed across different human cultures and eras. And then she asked me something that I had to sit with for a moment before answering. "In all of these reasons," she said, "is there one that you think is most true, not most common, most true?" I looked at the photograph, the mountains. "I think the truest thing," I said, "is that humans are impermanent and we know it. We don't live 200 years. We don't have the kind of time that would let us build our permanence into architecture or genealogical records that might outlast us. So we carry it on the body, because the body is what we have. It's the one thing that goes with us everywhere. A long pause. You know our lifespan, she said. The standard cultural briefing covers it. And yours? 70 to 90 years for most humans, longer in good conditions. She looked at me with an expression I could not fully decode, something layered, something that had more components than I had reference categories for. When you said in the corridor, she started, then you didn't say anything in the corridor. You said you were sorry. I was embarrassed. But when Sarava and I spoke with you at dinner, you described how long it took you to feel at home on the station, 6 months. Then you said, she paused, searching her memory. You said maybe all conscious species hit the same walls. I remembered. Do you believe that? I think the walls are different, but the experience of being stopped by them is similar. She looked at my arm again. I think you are right, she said. And I think the practices that grow up around those walls are where the walls are recorded. The tattoo is a record of a wall. I left home. I might not return. I will carry home instead. I didn't say anything for a moment. That's it, I said finally. That's the entire thing. She sat back in her chair. Something settled in her expression, the researcher's satisfaction of having found the right framing. I would like to discuss this further, she said, if that is agreeable. I'm a cultural liaison. Further discussion is literally the job. And outside the job, she asked. It was asked with precision, not with hesitation, a direct question. Outside the job too, I said. She stood, reached across the desk and held out her hand, palm down, fingers extended, a formal Vaskalhari gesture of established relationship that I knew from the briefings, but had never had directed at me personally. I mirrored it, palm down, fingers extended. Our hands weren't quite touching, but were close enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin. Corvin, she said. Her own name, given with intention. Marcus, I said. Part 4, the understanding between worlds. The next 3 weeks were, professionally and personally, among the most interesting of my posting. Corvin and I talked almost every day, sometimes formally, through the cultural exchange session structure, sometimes informally in the meal facility or in the accessible section of the monitoring installation, where she sometimes worked in a corner space that she'd arranged with data terminals and what she called her thinking equipment. Sarava was present in some of these conversations and absent from others. Her manner was different from her sister's, where Corvin asked questions directly and with momentum. Sarava tended to listen through long stretches before speaking, and when she spoke it was usually to say something that reoriented the conversation rather than extending it. I found her harder to read, and I find that honest thing worth saying in this document, even though it sits a little awkwardly in an official report, because the difficulty of reading her was part of what happened next. The cultural exchange session. About 2 weeks after the corridor incident, I ran an official cross-species cultural exchange session that Sarava and Corvin attended alongside 4 other crew members from 3 different species. The topic I'd chosen was permanence practices, how different species record and preserve meaning across time. I'd chosen it specifically, and I want to be transparent about that. The corridor incident, the conversations, Corvin's research interest, all of it had made me think that this was a topic worth exploring systematically, with a group, rather than just bilaterally. I went around the table asking each participant to describe one permanent practice from their culture, something that persisted, that was designed to last. The Methdurai engineer described the architectural glyphs that their species inscribes into the foundation stones of any new structure, a record of who built it, for what purpose, and under what conditions. The glyphs are required to be readable by any Methdurai for as long as the structure stands. The Felkanth researcher described their gene memory practice, the deliberate encoding of key cultural information into non-coding genetic sequences, passed down biologically so that every member of the species carries the cultural archive inside them. The Vaskalhari administrator from operations described the Varathkeln architecture I'd already heard about, the fact that sibling relationships are physically inscribed into home structures, creating an architectural family record. And then I described tattooing. I showed them my arm. I explained it the way Corvin and I had worked out together, the impermanence of human lives, and the human practice of carrying permanence on the body, because it goes wherever the body goes. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Sareva said something. She didn't say it to me. She said it to the group in trade tongue slowly. The humans carry their permanence inward, she said, because their time is short. They do not have 200 years to build records that the world will hold for them, so they become the record. A pause. There is something in this, she said. That is not smaller than the other practices. It is concentrated, distilled. Every mark is deliberate in a way that a species with more time might not need to be. I looked at her. She was looking at the table, not at me. The Methdur build foundation stones that may stand for 5,000 years, she said. A human builds a mark on their body that will stand for 60 years perhaps. Both intend permanence, but the human's permanence is chosen with a different weight. One of the other crew members asked a question. The conversation moved on. But I filed that observation in the internal part of my brain that keeps the things that matter. Theta Vos has one formal observation area, a section of transparent composite in the upper curve of the station's ring, about 40 meters of it, that offers a clear view of the belt and the surrounding space. It's not a popular area, too cold near the hull, even with the composite's insulation. The light is different there, sharper, more alien, less filtered. Crew members tend to prefer the warmer, more regulated environments of the interior. I go there sometimes because it helps me think, and because the belt is genuinely beautiful, and because I have a theory that the human need to look at open sky is so deeply embedded in our biology that looking at open space activates something similar. I was there about 3 weeks after the corridor incident, past the main evening service period when most of the station was in rest rotation. I had my notebook, the physical one, and I was writing. I heard the particular resonance of Voskelhari footsteps and looked up. Sareva. Alone, no Corvin. She stood at the composite and looked at the belt for a long moment. Then she looked at me. May I sit? Of course. She sat, not close. There was a meter or so of distance, which I'd learned was standard Voskelhari spatial preference in informal settings. For a while we both looked at the belt. Corvin told me about your conversation, she said finally, about the reason for carrying permanence inward. Good things, I hope. She described you as the most honest interlocutor she has met in a professional capacity, Sareva said. There was something in her voice that might have been warmth. She does not give that easily. I could tell, I said. She's precise. She is the more direct of us, Sareva said. I am told this is unusual for a younger sibling. What are you? She considered. I am the one who listens longer before speaking. I was told when I was young that I listened so long that people assumed I wasn't listening. But you were. Always. A pause. Marcus, she said. She used my first name. Sareva, unlike Corvin, had not yet used just my first name in a conversation. It registered. In the corridor, when I first saw you. Yes. I want to explain what I saw, more clearly than I was able to in the meal facility. You don't have to, I said. The Vamathilrai, the recognition of something you didn't know you were looking for, I understood that. You understood the word, she said, but I want you to understand the specific thing. I set down my notebook. The marks on your skin, she said, the permanence of them, the fact that you had chosen to carry something. But also, she paused, and in the pause there was the careful weight of someone choosing words with intention. The human body. I have read the species briefings. I have seen images in clinical documentation, but in the corridor I saw. Another pause. You are soft, she said. Not in a weak sense, biologically. The Voskelhari body is, she glanced at her own arm, the long lines of it. More structurally dense at the surface. Humans are different. The skin has a different quality, and to choose to permanently mark something so, she searched. Something that records every motion, every experience, every wound and healing to choose to mark that permanently. You were surprised it was beautiful, I said softly. She looked at me. Yes, she said, that is the precise thing. I was surprised to find it beautiful. Not because human physical characteristics are surprising in general, we are well briefed, but because in that moment, in that specific context, the combination of the vulnerability of the physical exposure and the permanence of the chosen marks, and the fact that you were not. Not diminished, I said, echoing the word she'd used before. Not diminished, she confirmed. That combination was Vamathilrai, something I recognized without knowing I'd been looking for it. The belt shifted outside the composite as the station's slow rotation moved our angle. The crystalline structures caught the light differently, the stained glass effect collapsing into something more amber, more like early morning light on stone. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "The wonder," I said, "the expression you had, was it about the tattoo specifically, or about something else that you were working out in that moment?" She was quiet for a long time, longer than her usual pause, long enough that I was starting to reconsider whether I'd overstepped. Then she said, "Both." "Okay," I said carefully. "Corvin and I," she started again. "We have been stationed away from our homeworld for 6 years, extended posting. This is not unusual for research personnel, but 6 years is long," I said. "For our species, for the sibling bond, the architecture of our family relationship, the permanent inscription, the physical record, is back on our homeworld. We cannot access it from here. The bond is in us, but the record is." She stopped, looked at the belt. I understood what she was saying. "The record is not where you are," I said. "And your record," she said, looking at my arm, "is always where you are." The belt hummed through the hull. You could feel it faintly in the composite of the seat, a crystalline vibration that was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. "You were homesick," I said quietly, "and you saw something that didn't need to go home to have its home with it." She looked at me. The amber of her eyes in the belt light was extraordinary. The luminescent undertones were more visible here, near the hull, where the station's interior lighting competed with the colder external light. "Yes," she said simply. "We sat with that for a while." "I'm sorry," I said. "For the corridor, not because it happened. I've stopped being sorry that it happened because I think it led somewhere worth going, but for the awkwardness of it." "I am not sorry that it happened," she said. "I was surprised, and then I was," the near smile subtle at the outer edge of her mouth. "As I said, Vamathilrai. The surprise of recognizing something you were looking for without knowing it." "Yes." "What were you looking for?" Another long pause. "Evidence," she said carefully, "that the things we carry cannot be taken from us, even far from home, even in a maintenance corridor on an outer rim station. Even," she paused, "even when we are impermanent beings, as you described, we carry what we carry. It goes with us." She looked at my arm one more time. The topographic lines of eastern Tennessee, visible where my sleeve had pushed up slightly from the cold near the hull. "You carry your mountains," she said. "And you carry your sister," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." Part 5, what happened after and what it meant. I've been trying to figure out how to write this final section for about 3 days now. It's the section where I'm supposed to be reporting, professionally in document format, to the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Commission about the outcome of the events described in the preceding sections. The resolution, the professional significance. And I can do that, I will do that. The ICEC deserves a proper account. But I also want to write it honestly, and honestly means acknowledging that the thing that happened in Corridor 14C and everything it sent rippling outward was not simply a professional incident. It was a human moment, which is what I actually am, a human, on a station far from home, figuring out how to be a person in a place where personhood looks different from every angle. So here is both things. The professional record. In the 8 weeks following the corridor incident, I facilitated 4 formal cross-species cultural exchange sessions, all of them significantly improved in quality and engagement from the sessions I had run prior. The improvement is directly attributable to the content shift, moving from the standard curriculum of broad cultural overview to more focused sessions on specific, concrete practices and their underlying meanings. Permanence practices was the first. We followed it with sessions on physical expression, on the role of duration in cultural meaning-making, and on the specific challenge of carrying cultural identity across displacement, something every member of a long-term off-world posting faces, regardless of species. Sareva and Corvin attended all 4 sessions. Several other crew members who had previously showed limited engagement with the exchange program attended 2 or more. The Methdurai engineer, Geth, the one who had accidentally coolant splashed me, which is a sentence I enjoy being able to write in an official document, attended 3 sessions and submitted a voluntary cultural document for the exchange library that was the longest and most detailed contribution we'd received in the previous 4 months. I documented all of this in my official monthly report to the ICEC, with methodology notes and recommendations for other liaisons. One of the recommendations read, "The most productive cultural exchange interactions on record at this posting began with an unplanned moment of personal exposure in an informal setting." This suggests that structured exchange sessions, while valuable, function most effectively when the relationships they operate within already contain some element of genuine, unscripted human-to-human or interspecies contact. Recommendation: investigate whether liaison programming should intentionally create more informal contact frameworks, rather than relying exclusively on scheduled, structured sessions. Dr. Feneva Alst read it and told me, in a morning meeting that ran 11 minutes, a personal record, that the recommendation was notably thoughtful, and that she would be forwarding it to the Commission's Methodology Review Board. I filed it and did not mention that it was inspired by a coolant spill and a poorly chosen changing location. Corvin's formal xenobiological interest in human body modification practices became a proper research thread. She applied for and received a small research grant from the Exchange Commission's Cross-Species Biology Fund, and spent 4 months producing a paper comparing body modification practices across 7 species in the cooperative, what they mark, where, why, and what the marking means in the context of the species' relationship with time, impermanence, and memory. She showed me a draft before she submitted it. She had, in the conclusion, a passage that I've had her permission to reproduce here, the only thing I'll quote directly in this document, because it earns the privilege. In the conclusion, she described the human practice of tattooing in the context of human lifespan, and wrote that humans seem to have developed a concentrated relationship with permanence, proportional to their awareness of its scarcity, not as a compensation for brevity, but as a practice of living fully within it. The permanence is not a defiance of mortality. It is a full and honest encounter with it. She showed me that passage specifically and asked if it was accurate. "Yes," I said, "that's it exactly." She submitted the paper. It received a positive review and was accepted into the Exchange Commission's Cross-Species Biological Studies archive. At the submission celebration, a small gathering in the meal facility, 5 people, which I consider the ideal size for a celebration, Corvin gave me a small carved object. Smooth stone, about the size of a large coin with a topographic pattern carved into it. The artist on the station, the Methdurai Geth, he was willing to make it, she said, when I described what I wanted. I turned it over. The pattern was rough, done by someone with skill in industrial toolwork adapting to finer work, but recognizable: mountain ridges, elevation lines, the shape of somewhere specific. "These are real mountains?" I asked. "The mountains visible from our homeworld," she said. "The ones we can see from the family structure where the sibling inscription is carved." I described them to Geth from memory. I didn't say anything for a moment. "So you can carry them too," she said simply. I put the stone in the breast pocket of my uniform, where I kept it for the rest of my posting. I want to be careful how I write this part, because Sareva is a private person and this is an official document. What I will say is this. Across the remaining 14 months of my posting on Theta Vos, the conversation we had in the Hull observation area, about what we carry, about permanence, about the records that go with us when the external records are left behind, was the first of many. She came to find me at the viewport a second time, then a third. It became a thing we did, not every week, not on a schedule, but with the rhythm of 2 people who had found that thinking near each other was useful. She talked about the research installation, about signal structures in the belt that she was becoming increasingly certain were non-random. She talked about the 6 years of posting. She talked, sometimes, about her sister, the way Corvin's directness had always been protective cover for both of them, The way the elder sibling learns to work through the younger one who charges ahead while you think. I talked about Tennessee, about what it is to leave a place and come back and find it the same and find yourself different. About my grandmother, who had told me when I left for the exchange program that the mountains would remember me, and I had thought that was just a nice thing to say, and now I was less sure. I talked about the work, about what it meant to spend your days translating not language but intention, not words but the meaning underneath them. Sarava listened more than she spoke in most of these conversations, which I'd learned was not distance, it was the opposite. At the end of my posting, the formal close of my grade 3 assignment, 14 months after the corridor incident, she came to the small departure ceremony the station held for departing crew. She didn't speak at the ceremony, but before I boarded the transit shuttle in the loading bay on deck 3, she held out her hand in the formal Vaskalhari gesture, palm down, fingers extended. I mirrored it. Marcus, she said. Sarava. She looked at my arm, the tattoo visible below my pushed-up sleeve, then at my face. You will take the mountains with you, she said. I will. Then something of this station is with you too, she said. You have been seen here, that does not leave when you do. I thought about what Vethsorn I meant, the moment when a place ceases to feel like performance and begins to feel like witness. It will stay, I said. She nodded, withdrew her hand. Her expression was the composed, still expression she wore in formal contexts. But the luminescent undertones in her skin were visible even in the loading bay's harsh light, brighter than baseline, the way they'd been in the corridor on the first day, the way they were whenever something was genuinely moving through her. I boarded the shuttle. I did not look back until the airlock closed. Then I did. The loading bay was already sealed. The transit shuttle was already moving. Outside the small viewport of the shuttle, as we cleared the station's ring, the singing belt caught the starlight the way it always does, fracturing it, dispersing it, throwing it back in 100 directions at once, beautiful and impermanent and full of the specific resonance of a place that knew it was alive. What I know now. I've been back on Earth for 4 months now. The mountains are exactly where I left them. My grandmother, who is 83 and still sharp as a wire edge, asked me what I'd learned out there. I thought about it for a while before I answered. That the things that matter most are usually the ones that happen sideways, I said finally. The ones you didn't plan. She said that she'd known that since she was about 40, and it was a shame it took young people so long to figure it out. She's probably right. The tattoo is still there. 19-year-old skin starting to show the first faint signs of time in the fine lines of the knuckles, but the ink is as settled as it was the day it was placed. The mountains, the topographic lines, the shape of somewhere that made me. In my breast pocket, the uniform is on a hanger in my closet because I don't need it on Earth, but I haven't unpacked the pocket yet, is the stone that Corvin had Geth carve. The mountains visible from a homeworld 200 light years from here. The ones 2 sisters look at from the window of a family structure where a sibling bond is inscribed in stone. I got caught changing my shirt in a maintenance corridor, and something that had been true all along became visible. That's usually how the most important things happen, I've found. Not in the scheduled sessions, not in the carefully constructed frameworks. In the accidental corridor at the wrong time, half-dressed, with coolant drying on your arm and a tattoo you forgot was there because it's been part of you so long you stopped seeing it. Until someone sees it for the first time and shows you by their seeing what it actually is. The last thing, I'm going to include one more thing in this document and then file it. Corvin's research paper, the one on body modification practices across species, was published in the Exchange Commission's archive about 2 months after I left Theta-Vos. She sent me a message when it went up, through the Commission's standard communication relay. The message was short. Her trade tongue is more efficient than her sister's, which is saying something. It said the paper received 12 citations in the first month. The passage about humans and permanence was the most cited section. I thought you should know, you described it correctly. The body is what we have, so we make it a record. K. I wrote back the paper deserved every citation. Thank you for letting me be part of it, and thank you for the stone. I can feel the mountains under my thumb when I hold it. M. She replied that was Sarava's idea, She suggested the specific elevation pattern. She described it to Geth herself. She said the mountains should feel like mountains, not just look like them. K. I held the stone for a while after I read that. Then I put it back in the pocket. There are things that go with you. When everything else is uncertain, when the station hums and the belt sings, and the species you live among read the world differently than you do, there are still things that go with you. You carry the mountains. You carry the people who thought to make them small enough to hold. You carry the record of being seen in a cold corridor at the wrong moment by eyes that found something in you that surprised even them.